Consuming data. Applications and websites today, they're no longer these self-contained entities. They rely on other applications and websites and web services to push and pull data from. So this means we're going to need a good understanding of these platform-independent data formats that we're going to be using to exchange information between systems. And I'm referring to JSON, JavaScript object notation, and XML, extensible markup language. So we'll kick this nugget off with a brief overview to talk about both of these data formats, how they differ from one another, and where we should be using one over the other. We'll also talk about web services. A lot of the times web services are going to return either XML or JSON, so that's why it's good to know how to work with both of them, because you may have to work with a web service that only returns one of those or both of those, and you'll have to make a decision. From there, we'll jump into the Virtual Nugget Lab. We'll start with JSON, how to create it, how to consume it and display it on our websites. We'll do the same thing with XML. Get a feel for what it looks like. We'll consume it, parse it, and display it in our web page. So once we get some simple examples on how these formats look and how we can work with them, then we'll get a good example, a good real-world example going on how to tap into a public web service. Google has a web service that we can use that sits on top of YouTube that is really just a search engine on top of YouTube that returns JSON objects. So we're going to take that web service and pull down a feed and display it inside of our own page, so we can stream videos right from YouTube on our page. I'll also show you a cool web service that we can use, a weather web service that we can tap into, that we're going to use Ajax with to dynamically update a part of our website that constantly shows us weather statistics for a given location. So what's JSON all about? Well, JSON is, again, JavaScript object notation. And even though it has the word JavaScript in it, it's not tied to just JavaScript. It's platform-independent, human-readable, lightweight, simple data format that we can use to exchange information across the internet. JSON is becoming increasingly more popular because it's easy to work with, because it's lightweight, and more so because in the web development world, we can easily take a JSON object and turn it into a JavaScript object to work with inside of our scripts. XML is extremely popular because it's been around for a while, and it has a lot of the same benefits as JSON. It's platform-independent, language-independent, human-readable. Where XML starts to get a bad rap is the format itself, mainly because of the ending tags here. Really bloats everything. Look, we've got more data here in the tags than the data itself. So this is the reason that it gets a bad rap right here. Hits. It takes a lot more space to describe this data than the data itself. So it's like taking a sledgehammer to a nail for small jobs, where JSON would be better suited for those small jobs because it's a hammer. So this is why JSON is much better suited for the web, because it's really meant for lightweight data exchange. So whether we're exchanging information from our web application to our server or a web service, it's perfect. And the fact that it translates into JavaScript objects with little effort is even better, because parsing XML, again, can kind of be a timely thing, where XML is better suited for representing complex, interrelated data structures, enterprise-type stuff. Web services, think of it as the vehicle that drives this data around the internet. It's a cross-platform technology that we can use to exchange information. So it's an always-on type thing that sits on a web service that anybody can tap into and use. And whoever builds the web service has control over what data format they expose through it. For instance, if they use SOAP, which are known as XML web services, the Simple Object Access Protocol just simply packages up and sends XML. So in that case, if someone built a SOAP XML web service that you're tapping into, you're stuck with XML. But again, anybody can really, if they build it in, say, .NET, they can build a web service, and they can choose to serialize the data coming out of that as JSON. And for instance here, REST web services are getting kind of popular. It stands for Representational State Transfer. It's a way that we can directly work with our objects from the results of the call. And you can format the results in XML or JSON. And again, you kind of have full control over the format that comes out of the web service. But a lot of the times, depending on if you're working with a vendor or if you're working with a public web service, a lot of public web services that I've worked with support many different kinds of formats, which is good, it's flexible, and it's what we want as web developers, because honestly, we do not want to work with XML on the front end. It's clunky, it's bloated, and it takes a lot of time to parse. JSON is perfect for that kind of stuff. All right, why don't we head into the Virtual Nugget Lab and see what it's like to work with both of these formats. We are in our development machine in the Virtual Nugget Lab. Let's bring up Visual Studio 2012 Web Developer Express. We have a new project inside of this solution called consuming_data, where in here we have a new page we're going to work with called consuming_data. We also have a folder in here called XML. Once we get into XML, we'll work with this XML file. And let's start here by just pasting in a script and working with JSON. So I'm going to paste in a bunch of code in here. We'll start at the top. We'll start just very simply by getting the hang of what the JSON data format looks like and how we can work with it directly. Now, in the past, when we created objects in JavaScript, we created a class and then we created live objects based on that class. Here, it looks very similar, doesn't it? We're creating a JSON object on the fly. And this is why it translates to JavaScript objects so well, because it's just simply property, value, separated by a colon. That's it. Now we can start working with this JSON object as if it were a regular old object based on a class, where we can just say tip dot property and that'll give us the value. So this is about really as easy as it gets. Let's just save this. I'll right click on our page. We'll view it in the browser. And let's just go ahead and choose here when this loads up, get tip JSON. All right, pretty straightforward. We're just taking that data and outputting it as HTML. Easy, right? Almost too easy, but that's what we like. So let's scroll down and get a little more of a complex example here. Here we have a get tips JSON routine that we have tied to a button. And here we're creating a more of a complex object that contains an associative array. An associative array just simply means, again, item, value. And in this case, our value is a bunch of tip objects formatted as JSON. So now if we wanted to work with these, we could call tips.oldTips, which will give us all of these tips, and then tips.newTips, which will give us all of these tips. And so we're calling this display JSON tips twice. The first time it iterates through, it'll display all the old ones, and the second time, all of the new ones. And if we scroll down and look at this function, I'm going to start throwing some jQuery at you now that we know how to use it. And let me just do this. Let me get this stuff out of here so you can see how easy this function is to use, and then we'll paste it all back in. So here it is. Here's our jQuery function, and what we're doing is we're passing in the JSON data. So the first time it comes in, it's going to contain all of the old tips, in which case we're just going to use the jQuery.each function, which will iterate through each one of those JSON items. And in here, it's going to return, inside of our anonymous function here, I and then item. I is if you want to work with the index, much like we do with loops, and item is if we want to work with the object and the properties directly. Now let me paste the rest of this code back in here, which should look familiar. It's the code that we built inside of our loop back when we talked about how to do loops in our flow nugget, and we've expanded on it throughout nuggets since then. But essentially all we're doing is a little bit of logic and then formatting. But the real point here is, look, working with this is just like working with a JavaScript object. We're just doing item.property just like we did above. So let's save this one, head back into the browser, refresh it, and now if we do get tips JSON, same result. So it just proves that the JSON data format is extremely simple to read, to understand, to create, and then to pass around between systems. So here first are all of our old tips, then we get our last two new tips. So how does this compare to XML? Let's scroll down here and paste some more code inside of our script block. And we'll scroll up, and the first thing we have here is just a function called getTipsXML, which uses AJAX to load up a file, and once that file is loaded, it's going to hit this callback function called displayXMLTips and take the XML. So we're going to get the data here from our tips.xml, and if we scroll down in Project Solution Explorer here into our project and open up our tips.xml, here's what it looks like. And now this is very simple XML, so this will be very simple to parse. But if we had complex XML, you'll see that it would take a lot more because parsing XML is a lot like parsing the DOM. You have to literally find what you're looking for and then walk through the nodes to extract the information that you want to extract. And now if we scroll down to our display XML tips function, it kind of makes it look easy because we're using jQuery, but you're going to see a couple of little nuances here. And again, this is very simple XML. So, but at any rate, JSON is still a lot easier to work with because, number one, we have to, rather than do an each and loop through everything inside of our node list, inside of our XML, we actually have to find. We have to do a find on the tip. So this will actually then do an each on that. So this is going to pull out every single tip and all the children underneath that tip element in the XML. Then we do something funky here. I'll show you that in a second. And then if we want to work with the nodes underneath tips, we need to do this. We need to do another find. So this is how things are going to really slow down because we're constantly searching the DOM, the XML DOM, to find these nodes and then extract the values. But other than that, it's not too bad extracting it because it's a lot like we were just doing. I mean, it's not as easy as object.property like in JSON, But you get the idea here is we're just pulling out all the element values. Now, if we had attributes in here, then again, we need to use some different code to pull out the attributes of the XML as well. Now, let's see what this looks like in the browser. Let's save it, head down to the browser, refresh it, and hit Get Tips XML. There it is. There's our 2 tips loaded from our XML file. All right, not too bad. Now, let's take a look and let's remove this little funky piece of code here. Hit Save, head back to the browser, hit Refresh, and now hit Get Tips. So this is just what I mean. The little nuances of working with XML gives us a blank node, a blank result in each one of them. So that's what this little defensive piece of code did here, is it just makes sure that if there's no value for this tip, if we get an empty tip here, then it's going to return true, which is just like doing a continue inside of a loop. So that's just the XML parser being funky and giving us white space nodes back as a value. So a lot of little things like that. XML will drive you nuts if you work with it too long. Now, if you remember here, we made an AJAX call, right? We did this. This is an asynchronous call, so it'll call it and it'll call back to our page here through our callback when it's done. One of the objectives for this nugget was to also do it using XML HTTP requests. And in a previous nugget, when we did callbacks, we actually saw how to do both an XML HTTP request and then an AJAX request, so you could see how they both differ in syntax. Well, I did the same thing again here, and with our XML, if we wanted to do the same thing, here it is. Only instead of using a callback here, we directly put inside of the event our actual routine, which will still call display XML tips. So this time, we're just doing it a little bit differently. Rather than using AJAX, we're using an XML HTTP request. And it's the exact same code as we looked at back in our callback nugget, but I just wanted to show you both ways that you could do it, and that XML HTTP request is kind of the old way of doing it. So if you're forced to do it this way, then now you know how. But if you don't, the best way to do it is absolutely using jQuery and AJAX. But here's the results. If we hit F5, here's load tips XHR, here's get tips XML. They both do the same thing. And I'm just appending it here, so that's why every time we click it, it's just adding more tips. Now let's do something cool. Let's take a look at how we can really use JSON in the real world to pull data back from a web service, parse it, and display it. So I'm going to paste a bunch of code in here. Let's start with our YouTube feed. So we've got 2 blocks of code in here. One is going to use a web service, our YouTube web service, to get JSON results and pipe them into a video feed within our page. Then we'll look at how to make an AJAX call to a weather service and bring back the weather for a specific location. All right, so let's start with our YouTube feed. So if we want to call the web service, we can do something like this. You'll need to get the URL of the web service, and now we're actually going to accept a couple of parameters when we call this. The user, this way we can give the user control over what user they want to pull a feed from out of YouTube, and then the max results to pull back. So all we're doing then is we're building our URL with those values. So here is the actual YouTube web service, gdata.youtube.com/feeds/API/users, and then you pass in the users, and then you can also, as a parameter, there's a bunch of other parameters out there as well, pass in max results and then the maximum amount of results. And here is where we're actually requesting that we want JSON. And we're also saying we want our callback to happen right inside of this function here. You can also put an actual callback method in here, and then it'll call back into that method when you're done. Now, we're just doing it all in one shot inside of here. And here's where we're going to use the jQuery.getJSON method. This is cool because it's going to get all the JSON from the web service and then send it through this data argument here inside of our callback function. From there, we're going to do an each. We're going to loop through all of the data.feed.entry. This is a JSON object collection that's going to contain all the information we need. We're going to extract the ID. I'll show you in a little bit. We need that ID. And here it is. Item, see, just like we did before, where we passed in the I for the index or item to actually work with it. We're working with the item itself to extract the ID. The $T contains the actual value, which is actually going to contain a URL with the ID appended to the end. So that's why we're just replacing, we're going to get rid of this part of the URL, which will give us just the ID. Then we extract the title, which will be the name of the YouTube video. Then we extract the first author. Then we extract the date, and we're just taking the first 10 characters off of the date, which will give us the year, month, and day. Then we're just going to generate a bunch of HTML based on that data. We're going to reuse our tip style where we're going to create an article, we're going to create a header. This time the header is going to contain the title of the video. Then we're going to use the new YouTube HTML5 player, which requires this iframe and text HTML. Then you specify your height and your width. And your source is going to be this right here, youtube.com/embed/ and the ID of the video, which is why we needed to extract the ID from the JSON. Then we've got a couple of other things inside of there. We just put a 0 on the frame so we don't see it. And then we just, inside of our footer, we put uploaded by the author, and then we also put the date on it. So that's it. We just generate HTML by extracting the values that we extracted from the JSON. And I also added this line of code for you here. This will actually use the old Flash player. So if you wanted to use the Flash player, you can just replace this iframe line with the object line here, and that'll make it the old SWF Flash player over the new HTML player. And then we just pipe all that in to our div, just like we've been doing, and that's that. One more thing I want to point out here is I added this console.log and passed in our item. This will log our entire JSON object into the console window in the browser so we can use our developer tools to look at it. And this is good for development purposes. If the site you're tapping into, the web service you're tapping into, doesn't have good documentation, then this is a great way to look at all the items that we can work with. So I added that in here. Let's save it and take a look at how this looks. So we're going to refresh our page here. I'm going to hit Get YouTube Feed and check it out. There it is. There's 5. Oh, and by the way, I should probably show you at the bottom here. We call Get YouTube Feed, pass in CBT Nuggets as our user, and 5. So we should get 5 videos streamed in, the most recent 5 videos from the CBT Nuggets user over on YouTube. And here it is. Here all of them are. Not bad, huh? For a little bit of code, we're getting a lot of functionality out of it, and it looks pretty cool, and it all works great. And if we hit F12 to go into our developer tools and over to the console tab here, here are all 5 of those objects. If we expand the first one, here's the first one, and you can see all the types here. So we can see that our author is an array, and that's why we had to pull out the 0 index of that array. And then we went through the name $T, which pulled out CBT Nuggets. In fact, if we head into here, you can actually see that. Look at this, item, author, 0.name.t. That pulled out and stored the author in here, and then we just piped that into our HTML. But if you scroll down here, there's a lot more information we could tap into. We could get categories if we wanted to, search terms, the list goes on and on. Content, title, here's publish, here's where we pulled out our date from right there. Here's the title, here's for the first object there's the micro nugget, updated, and there's statistics down here. There's a lot of good information about this video. And by the way, the ID, here's where we actually pulled out this ID. So we just did a replace on this, which gives us this ID, which we can then build that embed URL, pass that in to the video player, and that's what we get. So pretty awesome stuff. And by the way, if you want to learn more information about how to tap into a public web service like the YouTube one here, head over to developers.google.com/YouTube. This is a great place to learn how to do a lot of stuff in a lot of different languages. In fact, here I use the YouTube Data API documentation for version 2.0. Inside of the client library guides and code, they have JSON/JavaScript guide. This is just a very, very basic how to get up and running really quick and just output the titles of a specific feed into a list. There's also more detailed guides down here. There's a reference guide as well, which will give you a lot of good information about what parameters you can pass. Here's a bunch of parameters that we can pass to the YouTube service that we were looking at there. And just a lot of good information here about how to tap in and use that web service and all that you can do with it. Now, the other web service that I wanted to show you that I tapped into is uses the Weather Underground to tap in and pull weather conditions for a specific location. And I just hard-coded in here Eugene, Oregon, Nuggets headquarters. So we're going to see what the weather's like in their area. And we're using an AJAX call this time. So we're just doing a .ajax, passing in the URL, the data type JSON-P. And then on success, we're just putting in a anonymous inline function here, where once again, here's our item. We're going to console.log it so we can analyze all the JSON that comes back, and then we're just going to store all this information inside of an article. We're going to extract the city, the state, the zip from the location JSON object, and then also there's a cool little icon URL that shows the current conditions. So we'll push that into the area where we usually had our hit, how hot our hit was. So thumbs up, thumbs down, fire, all that kind of stuff, and then we'll display the current conditions and so on and so forth. But look at this, very little code once again, this time to do an AJAX call to tap into a web service. So this is perfect for stuff like this, weather, where you're constantly going to be updating it, rather than posting and refreshing the entire page, now Ajax can just take over and update that little portion of the page anytime it has an update. Perfect for what JSON was built for as well, because it's small, it's simple, and it's high performance. That little thing to update a little applet somewhere in the corner of our web page would take microseconds to do. So let's save this. Head down to the browser one more time here, refresh it, and this time let's get the Ajax weather. Hey, there it is. So there it is, Eugene, Oregon. It's currently cloudy and it's cold. Brr, 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius. So we even have the last updated. Now let me hit F12. And here is that object. Current observation. This contains all the current information about the weather over there in good old Eugene, Oregon. Here is all that good information. So I just grabbed the feels like underscore string, which gave us both Fahrenheit and Celsius. You could do one or the other if you wanted specific ones. I also grabbed the last updated time, which is in here somewhere. And then here's the icon URL I piped into that image. Currently it's cloudy, but look at all the good information here we could pull. We could get the wind gust, the weather, I mean, virtually everything. And here's the location JSON object that gives us all the information about the location and even where the weather was extracted from. And last but not least, let me show you the doodler and how this applies to the doodler. So in the doodler, we do the same exact thing. We pull back that JSON feed through the Google Web Service, and then we display it in here through the HTML5 video player, which, by the way, if you right-click on a video, you can tell that this is the HTML5 video player because we have a nice right-click menu rather than that old Flash plugin menu when you right-clicked on it. The only difference here, too, is that we're displaying it a little bit differently. We have a nice carousel that shows all of the recent video feeds, all done using CSS. So data consumption is awesome. It's the future. It's what's allowing us to enrich our websites with other people's information and system, and it's also going to allow us to expose our own data so other people can enrich their websites with our information. And it's just exciting to be a part of because the web seems like it's evolving even closer and closer as time goes on to one big integrated system. In the CBT Nugget, we learned how to consume data. We started off with an overview. We talked about what JSON and XML are. They're both human-readable, platform-independent data formats that we use to exchange information across the internet. We saw that the big differences between them is that JSON is good for web stuff, good for small, lightweight, easy, simple data structures to exchange information, and it works really well with JavaScript. And we saw that XML is more of a format for enterprise-type stuff. We also saw that web services is what drives all this data across the internet. Then we jumped into the Virtual Nugget Lab. We saw how to consume JSON. We saw how to consume XML. And then we put it all together by utilizing a public web service to pull down JSON, parse it, and display it on our web page. I hope this has been informative for you, and I would like to thank you for viewing.